Ann Marie Burr has been missing for nearly 59 years. A small 8-year-old girl who innocently went to bed one night, never to be seen again. A normal 8-year-old child whose story made national news, but her fate still remains unknown. Hello and welcome to Seeking Answers, and this is the bizarre disappearance of Ann Marie Burr. Ann Marie Burr was born on December 14th, 1952 in Del Norte County, California, into a Roman Catholic family to parents Donald and Beverly. She was the first of 4 children, with sisters Julie and Mary and one brother, Gregory. Eventually, the family moved and Ann and her 3 siblings were raised at 3009 North 14th Street in Tacoma, Washington. It was there, after she turned 8 years old, that the family faced their greatest fear. On August 30th, 1961, Ann had eaten dinner at a friend's house and returned home, where she and her 3 siblings were all sent to bed around 8 p.m. Other than her family, her friends Susie and Christine, who lived nearby, were the final people to ever see her alive. Ann shared an upstairs bedroom with her sister Mary, who was only 3 years old at the time of this tragic incident, while Gregory, aged 5, shared a bedroom in the basement with 7-year-old sister Julie. Throughout the night, there were reports of their pet cocker spaniel barking continuously, but the family thought nothing of it at the time, assuming he was merely disturbed by the cold, rainy night. During the early hours of August 31st, Ann woke up her parents on the first floor to let them know that Mary was crying. The 3-year-old was still recovering from a broken arm at the time, which was in a cast, and Mary was in a great deal of pain. Mother Beverly soothed her suffering child before sending both girls back to sleep, though it's uncertain what time this exactly occurred. At some point between 5:15 and 5:30 a.m., Mary once again woke up crying in agony, but this time it seemed much more severe. As Beverly checked on her child, she noticed that Ann was nowhere to be seen. Mary was completely alone. The front door, which had previously been locked, was now slightly ajar, and a small window in the living room was also open. Some grass from the front lawn was discovered inside the home, and a small piece of red thread was found under a brick near the window. And a bench had been overturned, propped up against the house, possibly used to access the entry point. Weirdly, upon investigation, a table of figurines beside the living room window was completely undisturbed, despite this seemingly being the method of entry. A footprint displaying the rainfall that took place was found near the overturned bench, but it was partly indistinguishable, making the investigation much more difficult. Upon examination, it was believed to have been a size 6 or 7 of the popular American shoe brand Keds. None of Ann's clothing or personal items were missing. It's believed that she left the home wearing nothing but her blue nightgown and a chain necklace with an engraved medal of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, an identification tag, and a medal of St. Christopher. On the morning of her disappearance, around 100 soldiers from the local military facility Fort Lewis, with an additional 50 National Guardsmen from Camp Murray, were helping the police with their search. By 11 p.m. that evening, over 75 square blocks surrounding the home had been covered, including wooded areas, but there was no sign of Ann anywhere. Commencement Bay was even searched by an entire diving team, but again, nothing turned up. There was practically no definitive evidence whatsoever that an abduction had even taken place, and because of this, the FBI could not intervene. Some neighbors did testify that they heard screaming coming from a vehicle with California license plates on the morning that Ann went missing, but when this driver was located, it was concluded that this noise was from his vehicle's radio and was merely mistaken for screaming. On September the 8th, 1961, just over a week after her disappearance, Donald and Beverly Burr voluntarily took lie detector tests as people believed they were withholding information about what happened to their daughter. Both tests came back with truthful results, though it's worth noting that these tests are only 97% effective and aren't admissible in a court of law. The next day, Ann's grandmother posted a $1,000 reward for any information about her granddaughter's whereabouts, which was then increased to $5,000 once they were given more funds. Within the first 12 days of Ann's disappearance, over 1,500 people were interviewed, including a 31-year-old ex-Marine by the name of Hugh Byron Morse. Hugh, born in Kansas City in January of 1930, was the product of a forced marriage, though his father abandoned the family when he was just a baby. He ended up being raised in an abusive home and was physically assaulted with a hammer by his grandmother at just 4 years of age. And because of this abusive upbringing, Hugh developed a strong hatred for women. He was arrested in May of 1951 for indecent exposure and assaulting a woman in North Carolina, before later being convicted of several burglary charges. In 1955, Hugh was charged with trying to molest 2 8-year-old girls in Fairfield, California, and was sent to therapy. However, he was released just 2 years later after they believed he had been cured. He was arrested for further sex crimes in Burbank, California, a mere 4 months later. Hugh began a routine of constantly prowling neighborhoods, breaking into houses and apartments, and creeping on young girls and women in their beds, before he settled in Spokane, Washington. On November the 7th, 1959, Hugh Byron Morse raped and murdered 28-year-old Glory Bree, followed by 69-year-old Blanche Boggs on September the 26th, 1960, and 2 weeks later, on October the 10th, he attacked Beverly Myers, but she managed to escape with her life. On October the 28th that same year, he broke into the home of his wife and attempted to strangle her, but she also escaped and he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. There are numerous other unknown victims of his, but it is known that he raped at least 2 women in Atlanta, Georgia in the spring of 1961. Amazingly, he was arrested on a charge of voyeurism, but he paid a bail of just $200 and was able to walk away because the officers failed to recognize his face on the wanted poster hanging just above the jailhouse. On July the 1st, 1961, Morse entered the Birmingham, Alabama home of Bobby Ann Landini, choked her to unconsciousness, and then beat her to death with a pipe. He then relocated to Dayton, Ohio, and on August the 2nd, he stabbed Mildred Chastain to death. Moving to Minnesota, Morse strangled and killed Carol Ronan after raping her, and he then lured a 6-year-old girl into an alley to molest her. On August the 29th, Morse was finally apprehended and arrested without a struggle. They found a knife, a razor, and a loaded pistol in his bedroom. However, he was soon discarded as a possible suspect for the abduction of Ann Marie Burr, because the last time she was seen alive was August the 30th, just 1 day after he was already arrested and in police custody. In June 1962, an employee at a service station in Portage-la Prairie in Manitoba, Canada, informed the police that he saw a girl who he believed was Ann, accompanied by a man and a woman who spoke to her far too harshly to be her parents. He reported that he even heard the girl say that she was from Tacoma. In July of 1963, just shy of 2 years since Ann went missing, her parents adopted an infant girl called Laura. Beverly and Donald never gave up hope that their little girl would return home. They admitted that nobody could ever take her place, but they felt like the adoption would help everyone in the family emotionally. Beverly also hoped that making the adoption public would help keep the story in the news and possibly aid in Ann's return. But the police were facing pure frustration and disappointment as no credible leads were rising, and there wasn't much evidence to work with. This case seemed completely unsolvable. However, in the summer of 1964, 3 years since Ann was last seen, a 10-year-old girl by the name of Lynn Stewart vanished from her home on South Melrose Street in Tacoma, Washington, not far from the home of Ann Marie Burr. Her family and friends had absolutely no idea where she had vanished to. This story didn't get nearly as much news coverage as Ann Marie did all those years earlier, but the police found the similarities between the two cases strangely unnerving. Lynn's parents had claimed that their daughter was very intelligent for her age and could take care of herself, but did confess that she had previously run away from home and was soon discovered at the house of a relative. She was the eldest of 6 children and had allegedly stormed out of her own home after a slight argument with them and was perhaps scared of the consequences of returning. Lynn was very fond of the Point Defiance Park area, much like Ann Marie was, particularly the Funland amusement area. It was here she met and started talking to a man who called himself Bob Brown. He took Lynn to see a movie at the Fife Drive-In Theatre and then offered her a ride to Spokane, Washington. For 3 solid days straight, Lynn Stewart rode around the Pacific Northwest in a brand new Buick Electra convertible, with the man referring to himself as Bob Brown, the man who kept a small caliber handgun in his glove compartment. They ate meals in restaurants together. He even paid for her to get a haircut. Miraculously, he did drop her safely on the streets of Tacoma just 3 days later in a brand new dress, new shoes and new socks, with $15 in her pocket. A clerk in a local supermarket recognized her and called the police. But bizarrely, Lynn denied her identity and told the officers that her name was actually Mickey Anderson. Regardless, she was taken to the police station for questioning and her parents were even brought in. It's unknown what was said, but they were seen leaving in tears. At this point, Lynn was taken to Raymond Detention Hall, where children in custody were routinely placed. She was described as being very dazed and very reluctant to return home. She remained at the detention hall for her own protection, as this Bob Brown had yet to be found. During questioning, Lynn, seemingly now out of her dazed state, informed the police that she had actually slept with the man in his car. The suspect was now charged with kidnapping, carnal knowledge which involved sexual intercourse with a minor, and flight to avoid prosecution. She then drew a sketch of the man to help the officers locate him, but interestingly, he was already known to Spokane police as they already had his mugshot on file. A divorced 48-year-old former Army private and automotive parts salesman by the name of Ralph Everett Larkee. Due to the severe nature of the accusations, the FBI finally joined the investigation for this extensive search. 2 months after he had abducted Lynn Stewart, Ralph Everett Larkee was found living in a Portland, Oregon apartment under the name of Paul Lindley. On September the 9th, 1964, FBI agents knocked on his door and identified themselves before they heard a gunshot. Larkee had put that same small caliber pistol from his car into his mouth and pulled the trigger. But amazingly, Larkee had somehow survived his suicide attempt. He remained in critical condition in a coma for 6 months before passing away on March the 31st, 1965, before he could awaken and be questioned over the disappearance of Ann Marie Burr. Another suspect was a car lover by the name of Richard Raymond Melish. He had a long rap sheet for stealing automobiles, but made a habit of escaping from prison anytime he was locked away. In 1965, 4 years after the disappearance, Melish read an update on the search in the newspaper, offering $5,000 as a reward. Melish actually wrote to Donald Burr and claimed that he knew where his daughter was. Surprisingly, in exchange for the information, all he wanted was for the money to go to his family instead, his wife and children. He went on to claim that he was in a car with a man and a woman who abducted Ann Marie, but they had kidnapped the wrong child and had to improvise. He stated she was now living in Oklahoma with the couple, and he even said that he had seen her a few times over the years. Upon this new information, it was also discovered that there were reports of a car with 2 men and a crying girl speeding away from the Burr neighborhood the morning that Ann had disappeared. And the car had either an Oregon or a California license plate. The police concluded that if this story was true, the child wasn't in any immediate danger, but they still needed to approach this with extreme caution. It wasn't until 2 years of Melish reiterating his story, the police decided that it was enough to finally verify, flying him out to Oregon, but by the time he arrived, his story completely changed. He now claimed that he and his friend David Withnell took the girl, but he was so disgusted by Withnell's abuse of the child, he refused to go into further detail. He went on to claim that they drove back to Tacoma to a bean farm where Withnell paid him to wrap the dead body in a quilt and bury her 3 feet deep, right next to a tree out of the way so that the body could be discovered. On October the 11th, 1967, as rain created a dreary landscape, some officers went to check out the location. Melish had sketched a map of the farm, but he changed his story for a second time, now claiming that they put the body in the pond and not by the tree. Unfortunately, a flood took place in 1964 which completely changed the entire landscape of the farm. If a small body had been in the pond, it would have been completely washed away during the flood. Regardless, they checked the pond anyway, but found nothing. David Withnell had committed suicide a few years prior, but the police questioned his widow, who admitted that a quilt had gone missing from her home, and her husband Ann Melish did indeed travel with it to Washington in 1961, around the time Ann Marie went missing. She also later found out that her husband had molested one of their daughters, which is why she left him, but she maintained that he just wasn't capable of murdering a child, and nor was Richard Melish. Melish also claimed that he knew Donald Burr, but when questioned, Donald had no idea who he was, which confused Melish further. He also agreed to a sodium pentothal exam, essentially a truth serum, and he gave his consent for a polygraph test to prove that he was telling the truth, but later changed his mind. There's no evidence, however, that he went through with either. There's absolutely no way to tell if Melish was telling the truth or not. Was he lying to get his family some money? Or was he genuinely the man who killed or assisted in killing Ann Marie Burr, and his memory of the location genuinely became muddled over time? After losing their daughter, the family always kept up hope. Once they moved house, they actually published the address in the local newspapers, as well as their new phone number, just hoping that the little girl would one day find her way back home. Unfortunately, this led to many prank calls and forms of harassment. One source states that she received one phone call in particular that really stuck out. On February the 20th, 1964, Beverly received a call from a man who sounded quite young but well-spoken and well-mannered. No nervous stuttering, confident with no distinguishable accent. He claimed that Ann Marie was now living in the Phoenix, Arizona area, but he would only give Beverly further information if she undressed for him. Beverly was greatly embarrassed but reluctantly informed the police of the call, leading to them monitoring and installing recording equipment in their home for further calls. No more were reported. So was this call a genuine offer of a sick trade for more information? Or was this yet another prank to feed someone's sick fantasies? Beverly and Donald struggled to come to terms with it, often arguing, and their marriage began to deteriorate as Donald turned verbally abusive, and Mary, who was the last to see Ann Marie alive, suffered mental health issues from an early age, many believing the incident to be the primary cause. Another suspect was the family's own neighbor, a 15-year-old boy called Robert Bruzas. Beverly was always anxious about him as he often sat outside their home in his car. The police investigated this behavior, but it was merely him listening to music on his radio. But Robert had always been very friendly with Ann, and it was reciprocated, somewhat even flirtatiously. Ann would often refer to Robert as Loverboy, while he called her my girl and dear. Ann's parents would always question why a 15-year-old boy would want to spend so much time, let alone flirt with, an 8-year-old girl to this nature, especially with these kinds of pet names. For 50 years, Bruzas had been one of the chief suspects, but he claimed that it never bothered him. He underwent a polygraph test to try to clear his name, but it determined that he was lying. However, he blamed the failure on his heightened nerves. No evidence whatsoever has ever linked him to the scene of the crime that night. As the years went by, leads continued to pop up, but none ever seemed to pan out. An unknown young girl was found in Omaha, Nebraska, who was suffering from amnesia, but it wasn't Ann Marie. 2 boys discovered a bottle with a note inside claiming that she was being held prisoner by some bank robbers. Her name was carved on a sandstone cliff at a roadside picnic area just southwest of Tacoma. But one of the oddest happened several years after Ann disappeared. Her mother Beverly received an empty envelope addressed to their new house. In a panic, she took the envelope to the police along with one of Ann's old school books to hopefully compare the handwriting. However, it was inconclusive. There was absolutely no way to determine whether or not the writing was from the same person, or even whether they were from a child, a teenager, or an adult. Was this Ann Marie Burr trying to contact her mother, or was this merely yet another heartless prank towards a grieving parent? It wasn't until 1978, 17 years after her disappearance, that infamous serial killer Ted Bundy made an appearance on the suspect list. He was being questioned on the disappearance of numerous women, but always refused to confess to anything at first. However, the investigators decided to ask Ted what he thought may have happened, to get him to talk in detail in the third person. That way, Ted would feel comfortable possibly retelling the story and not actually confessing. Nothing he said could be used against him for an arrest, but one part of his story in particular caught their interest. They were at a place where there was an orchard or a number of trees or something. As he came up behind her, she heard him. She turned around and he brandished a knife and grabbed her by the arm and told her to do what he wanted her to do. You know, to follow him. He pushed her off the sidewalk into this darkened wooded area and told her to submit and do what he wanted her to do. But he found himself with this girl who was struggling and screaming. Not screaming, but let's say just basically arguing with him. There were houses in the vicinity and he was concerned that somebody might hear. And so in an attempt to stop her from talking or arguing, he placed his hand over her mouth. So, not thinking clearly but still intending not to harm her, let's say he placed his hands around her throat, just to throttle her into unconsciousness so that she wouldn't scream anymore. She stopped struggling and it appeared that she was unconscious, but not in his opinion to a point where he had killed her. Then let's say he removed her clothes and raped her and put his own clothes back on. At about this point, he began to notice that the girl wasn't moving. It appeared, although he wasn't certain, that he'd done what he had promised himself he wouldn't do, and he had done it really almost inadvertently. So he took the girl by one of her arms and pulled her to a darkened corner of this little orchard, and then in a fit of panic fled the scene. Ted even went into graphic detail of the precise layout of the neighborhood and house, very similar to the Burrs. He was asked if he believed that the kidnapper of Ann Marie had possibly killed before this, and he theorized that the culprit may have started around the age of 14 or 15, and they may have begun with an 8-year-old child. At the time of this incident, Ted himself was 14. If Bundy genuinely had nothing to do with her disappearance, it's incredibly bizarre that he would make these statements, knowing very well it would now implicate himself in the process. After all, not only did the ages match, but it was discovered that Ted Bundy was a resident of Tacoma, Washington at the time. He also worked as a paperboy, delivering newspapers, some say in the Burr neighborhood, and that his paper route involved passing their family home. Others dispute this claim and say his delivery route was nowhere near their house. He also visited his great uncle a lot, who was a piano teacher and lived just a few blocks from the Burr house. Some even claim that the uncle taught Ann Marie Burr, but even Ann's mother said that this was not the case during the interviews towards the end of her life. What is known is that the mysterious size 6 shoe imprint that was found at the scene of the crime would have matched Ted's teenage feet, and the Burrs and the Bundy families were not unknown to one another, as Beverly and Louise, Ted's mother, knew each other in passing. Both, however, denied their children being acquaintances. Regardless, Sandi Holt, who is a mutual friend of both, claims that she knows for a fact that Ann Marie and Ted knew one another, because she knew both of them. She claims that Ann would follow Ted around like a puppy dog and would watch him get his newspapers ready to deliver, seemingly with a schoolgirl crush like she had for Robert Bruzas. Ann just seemed to feel much more comfortable around teenagers, and this may have led to her disappearance. Furthermore, another source states that that mysterious phone call that Beverly received after they moved came from a young Ted Bundy himself. And allegedly, Ted admitted to making this call, although there doesn't seem to be evidence to back up this claim. Ted Bundy was a troubled child with a troubled upbringing, showing signs of things to come beginning at the age of just 3. During his teen years, he often peeped in on women through windows, burgled homes and cars, and had a fascination with dead or maimed bodies. However, Bundy claimed to have not committed a murder until he was 24 in 1971, 10 years after Ann Marie went missing. During his incarceration, various people taped interviews with Ted and subsequently published several books detailing his crimes. The Burrs themselves read one of these and heard some of the tapes, and it made them question whether or not the girl in Bundy's story was their daughter. Beverly actually wrote to the authors immediately in regards to this revelation. My husband and I read your book slowly, word for word, practically memorizing it. We noticed that there are a lot of similarities between Ted and our missing daughter Ann Marie. The orchard, the noises in the yard I heard late at night, how close we lived to the campus where Ted's great uncle was a music professor, how Ann took piano lessons across the street from the college's music building, the possibility that Ted was actually a paperboy in our neighborhood, the bench police thought a teenager might have used to look through the living room window, the print of a tennis shoe found on the bench near the basement. I even wonder if my Ann was Ted's first victim, and therefore maybe the publicity regarding her was so great and lasted such a long time that it actually prevented him from committing another murder until he reached his 20s. Ann Marie's mother Beverly actually wrote to Ted Bundy himself during his time on death row, hoping to find some closure into what actually happened to her daughter, even offering him complete forgiveness. Dear Ted, on August the 31st, 1961, just before school was to start for you and our children, there came a black rainy night with lots of heavy winds. You were 14 and had been wandering the streets late at night and peeping in windows and taking cars. I feel your first murder was our Ann Marie Burr. The bench from the backyard was used to climb in the living room. The orchard next door was a dark setting for a murder. What did you do with the tiny body? God can forgive you. With all appeals likely to be refused and soon there is nothing left for you in this world, there can still be everything good for you in the next. Your life started going wrong somewhere when you were very young. There had to be a lot of bad things happen to make you have your strong feelings of hatred. I came close to ruining my life because of my cruel actions and feeling no sorrow about them. A lot of strange circumstances brought help to me or I would not have found myself, even though I knew I needed help and my actions were getting out of control. You should have received that same help when you needed it. God can still give the help to you. If you can gather together any strength you have left and try to feel a real sorrow inside for the horrors you have brought so many. You will face these horrors alone if there is no chance to be with God after you die. You have nothing more to lose in this world. By explaining your sickness, you will feel sorrow and gain everything in the next life, as God promised you and all of us. Please try. There isn't much time. I am deeply sorry you did not get help when you needed it. I have not written until now because the end of life for you did not seem near until now. Will you write back to me regarding Ann Marie? Amazingly, Ted Bundy actually did write a response on June the 8th, 1986. Dear Beverly, thank you for your letter of May the 30th. I can certainly understand you doing everything you can to find your daughter. Unfortunately, you have been misled by what can only be called rumors about me. The best thing I can do for you is to correct these rumors, these falsehoods. First and foremost, I do not know what happened to your daughter Ann Marie. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. You said she disappeared August the 31st, 1961. At the time, I was a normal 14-year-old boy. I did not wander the streets late at night. I did not steal cars. I had absolutely no desire to harm anyone. I was just an average kid. For your sake, you really must understand this. There is also a rumor that I was your paperboy back in 1961. Again, I'm almost certain that I wasn't because I would remember news of the abduction, which I do not. My paper route covered an area just north and east of the Narrows Bridge. Again and finally, I did not abduct your daughter. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. If there is still something you wish to ask me about this, please don't hesitate to write again. God bless you and be with you. Peace. Ted. A lot of this response is called into question, however, as at the age of 14, Ted was roaming the town on his bicycle, was an avid window peeper, a thief, a viewer of pornography, would often drag girls into the woods to urinate on them, torture and abuse animals, and was addicted to crime and detective stories. Considering he was a paperboy and lived in the area, it would have been incredibly unlikely that he didn't hear of Ann Marie's disappearance when it made the front page news on a daily basis.
If he would be executed tomorrow without an answer, I would just feel grateful that he has confessed to what he has. And if we don't get an answer, we'll just have to keep going on and pray and hope somehow we will someday know.
These letters were written around the same time that Bundy finally started confessing to various crimes. It's important to note that he admitted to several kidnappings, thefts, murders and rapes, even describing them in graphic detail and pinpointing where he disposed of the bodies. But he still wholeheartedly denied having any involvement with Ann Marie Burr's disappearance, which leaves even more questions. He claimed that he would have never hurt a little girl. But despite this, Bundy's final known victim was a 12-year-old girl by the name of Kimberly Leach. Ted consistently refused to discuss this particular death and always seemed emotional whenever it was brought up.
Little Kimberly Leach, 12 years of age. I think the public outcry is greater there because an innocent child was taken from a playground. What did you feel after that? Were there the normal emotions 3 days later, or where were you, Ted?
I can't really talk about that right now. That's weird.
That's too painful.
I would like to be able to convey to you what that experience is like, but I can't. I won't be able to talk about it.
Okay.
He also had informed investigators that something happened to him when he was around the age of 14 or 15, but it's unclear what exactly he was referring to. But this was around the time when Bundy discovered the truth of his illegitimate birth, which many say contributed to his mental state deteriorating. He also claimed that this was around the time he began to fantasize about approaching a young girl in the woods, and that it had awoken some sexual activity inside him. In 1987, during his final confessions, he did admit that there were some murders that he would never talk about because they were committed too close to home, too close to family, or involved victims who were very young. Was one of these victims 8-year-old Ann Marie Burr? Some detectives maintain to this day that they believe Ted Bundy was guilty, and perhaps his refusal to confess to this crime was simply ruled down to his remorse. After all, he wouldn't talk about the murder of a 12-year-old girl, and how else could he have possibly known all of the specific details of the location without being familiar? However, other investigators rule Bundy out completely, including his own family. Ann Marie was up and down a few times that night, helping her 3-year-old sister to get to their parents' room. It's possible that she spotted someone at the window that she recognized and trusted, and was tricked into opening the door for them, and the bench and window was possibly a ruse to throw investigators off the scent. After all, Ted Bundy in particular had a history of manipulation and gaining the trust of young women and girls through flirtation. But it's also possible that someone familiar with the house climbed through the window and entered Ann's bedroom upstairs. Many believe that Ann was Ted Bundy's first ever murder, including mystery writer and former friend Ann Rule, though Ted always maintained that he didn't start killing until he was 24, 10 years later. However, he did go on record by saying that a murderer's first ever kill was special and should never be talked about. Ann's parents believed that their daughter possibly was killed and had been buried in excavation sites on the campus of the University of Puget Sound, where construction was taking place at the time. Ann's father Donald claimed that he saw a teenager in a ditch on the university campus on the morning of his daughter's disappearance, kicking some dirt into the ditch, and he believed that it was Ted Bundy. Days later, the ditch had been filled in. However, Beverly stated later on in life that she did not believe that Bundy was responsible, though Ann's brother Gregory maintains that it's a strong possibility. Ted was interviewed the day before his execution, just hours before death, the final time to clear everything up, and he still maintained that he had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Ann Marie Burr. In 1999, the Burr family held a memorial service to commemorate the life of Ann Marie. Her father, Donald, passed away in 2003 at the age of 77, while Beverly followed from congestive heart failure in 2008, neither ever finding out the truth of what happened to their daughter that many summers ago. Though Beverly believed that the perpetrator was an unnamed 17-year-old neighbor boy who lived 3 doors down from their house at the time, from a very religious family who she found somewhat strange. In 2011, 50 years after Ann was last seen, with better forensic techniques now available, authorities tested contact evidence from the red thread found at the crime scene and compared the results to old DNA samples of Ted Bundy. However, the findings were inconclusive, and it failed to link him to being at the household, though it didn't rule him out either. So what really happened to Ann Marie Burr on that rainy summer morning? Was she really abducted? Did she awaken in the night and leave the home on her own free will? Was she tricked into letting a criminal inside her home? Or did one of the most famous serial killers in history take one final secret to his grave? Ann Marie Burr has been a missing person for nearly 59 years, and amazingly, we are still seeking answers.